We're now going to look at how macros are configured in Keyboard Trader. In order to help demonstrate this, we're going to be using an older version of the Platinum sample workspace. It has some minor differences from the current version, including the macro names, but aside from that, it pretty much has the same functionality. If you were to click the Hotkey Mapper button right here, you would see that there's a lot of different macros in the bottom of the screen. All these different macros have hotkeys assigned to them, as you can see over here on the right side. The name of the macro is on the left. And you can see in the middle that there's an execution approach called safety medium. That's a little bit of a more advanced topic we're going to discuss later. But for now, just notice that there's lots of different macros that you can click on, and you can assign hotkeys to all these macros. So whatever hotkey is assigned to a macro, if you trigger that hotkey with your keyboard, the macro is going to execute. Okay, so how do you know which key triggers which macro? If you have the keyboard plugged in, then if you were to press one of your keys, okay, let's press it. You see how this W is highlighted over here. That means the hotkey W is triggered when you press that key with your keyboard. So which macro does that trigger? Well, we see W is assigned to this macro right here. So this is the macro that's triggered when you press that button. If you want to see what this macro actually does, just right-click this macro and press View this macro in Macro Builder. Now you have the Macro Builder, which is launched. On the top of the screen, we see that a macro is highlighted. That is the same macro that was just highlighted in the hotkey mapper. The entire top section over here is a list of all the macros in your workspace. So if you want to, you can see them all by scrolling through the list. But let's just look at the bottom of this window. Down here, we see all the steps that are contained in the selected macro up top. So if you were to select a different macro, see how the steps in that macro change. Okay, but for now we're just going to go back to the one that was highlighted before. If you look down here, we see that there are a lot of steps in this macro. These are all called macro steps. There's 4 columns here. On the left side, we see a contract name, a function, and then we see an empty column here, which is not used for this macro, but it's used for other ones. And then we see another column called macro. Essentially, if you have base functions which are called by a macro, as they are here on the left side, then you will see those contract references and the functions that are called in these left 2 columns. And then also, if there's a variable value associated with those functions, you'll also see that over here in this column. The last column, called macro, that's used for when you call a macro from another macro. We allow you to do that to improve the organization of your macros. And if you write a macro which is used by a lot of macros, then it's much easier to write that macro once and to simply call it however many times you want. So in any event, we see here that each one of these macro steps is a macro containing a certain number of other steps. If you want to see the entire contents of this macro, then you can just press the macro tracker button down here. As you can see, once the macro tracker launches, the same macro that was highlighted before in the macro builder is again highlighted here. And below, we see all of the macro steps that are contained in that macro. So back to where we started, when you press that hotkey with your keyboard, these are all the steps that are executed. Now we should mention that it's not always executed for every contract. Which contracts have the functions executed for them depends on the execution approach and also the trading state for each contract. So just as a brief example of a macro with a medium safety execution approach like we see here, if only 2 of your 6 contracts have their trading states on and the other 4 have the trading states off, then only 2 of your contracts in this macro will have the functions executed. So this is one of the main benefits of using macros, especially with the medium safety execution approach, because you can write one macro which is able to execute on a larger number of contracts, and then when you're trading, you can determine on the fly which ones it's going to execute for, just by controlling the trading state.